So my name is Linda Asquith and I'm one of the parishioners here at St Helen's, and joined with Charlie and I, we've organised this event for Holocaust Memorial Day. Before we get started, a few housekeeping. If you wish to use the toilet at any time, it's through this door on my left. You just follow the signs heading to your left. There's no fire alarm expected, so if there is a fire, please exit by that door, or there's another door through the emigration that you can use. What the plan of today is that I'm going to introduce Charlie, and then Charlie's going to talk for around 45-50 minutes or so, and then we're going to make our way through into the other room there. There's an opportunity for refreshments if you want them, and also we'll be making our way towards Ernst and Gertrud's grave, where there'll be an opportunity to pay our respects during a short prayer. So we're here to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day, and it's a day which marks the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp. And it's an opportunity to mark and remember the 6 million people killed through Nazi persecution, the almost 1 million people killed and murdered in Rwanda, the 8,000 men and boys murdered in Bosnia, alongside genocides across the world. And it's also an opportunity to remember those whose lives were changed irrevocably by genocide, those who survived and rebuilt lives elsewhere, and those who lost their lives later, their deaths a direct result of the ongoing impact of the intolerance and hatred they experienced. So today's event is hosted jointly by myself and Charlie from the Parks Institute at the University of Southampton. So as well as being a parishioner here at St Helen's, I'm also an academic, and my research focuses on life after genocide. Charlie is a Wolfson PhD scholar at the University of Southampton, and his research focuses on German Jewish familial correspondence during the 1930s and 40s. Both mine and Charlie's research highlight the importance of refugee stories and the ongoing impact of genocide on those who escape and those who are left behind. Because we can't tell the millions of stories of those who've died, we will focus today on 2 people, Ernst and Gertrud Neustadt, and they were a German Jewish couple who escaped Nazi Germany and migrated to the UK, and they're buried in our graveyard here at St Helen's. Ernst and Gertrud's story unites mine and Charlie's research, and I'm delighted to welcome Charlie here, and I'd like to invite him to come up and speak to us now.
Just get my slides up and I can see what you can see. Yeah, thank you very much. Firstly, for having me here and for allowing me to talk to you on HMD about the aspects of my research that I haven't touched upon in a few years now. And it's nice to kind of feel this full circle at the moment, to be able to talk in a place that Ernst would have come to at some point, and to kind of retell his story in a space which is evidently important to his life and his wife's life in some way. So the plan for my talk is to, I suppose, give you a rundown of their life, their existence, their early life in Berlin, their migration to Frankfurt, and then also afterwards their life in the UK. As Linda said, my research more broadly looks at the correspondence of separated German Jewish families during the 1930s and 40s. As part of this, I come across these sort of stories all of the time about people that appear about being forced to move, their lives being uprooted, and this is just one of those stories. And as we've said, these stories are ways of accessing a past that perhaps is feeling more and more distant the further we move on in time. Survivors are passing away. The fact is that within 10 to 15 years there may not be any left. These stories, these kind of individual narratives, these sources that we're going to look at today can take us back to the root, back to the reality of the lives of many of these people. Can I have the next slide, please? I feel like I could sort of also enjoy this. So this is Ernst Neustadt here. It's the only photograph that exists of him. We don't know particularly where it came from. It was given to me at the start of the research in a very bad condition, but we managed to kind of restore it, and you can see exactly what he looked like. We don't know where it was taken, we don't know when, but this is the only picture that exists of Ernst. There are no pictures of Gertrude that I've been able to find in nearly 5 years of research on this, so I doubt it exists. Can I have the next slide? I thought it'd be worth to kind of start this by saying how one comes to research a German Jewish refugee whose life ended in Wakefield, when at the time I was doing my masters at the University of Exeter. These sorts of stories of refugees are often focused around those that became important as scholars, important academics, politicians, artists, and we have quite a lot of details on their lives. Ernst had no trace in the modern world unless we had to compile things together from various archives across various different countries. And the first kind of place I started to look and find about his life was at the Devon Heritage Centre, which is a sort of an industrial estate just outside of Exeter. And in it is the records of a place called Dartington Hall, which is in Loch Ness. Now the Dartington Hall archives are massive. One of the pieces that is kind of important to this research, I went there when I was doing my masters, and I asked them and said, "What do you have on refugees?" I just gave them a kind of broad sort of title about what I was interested in. And they gave me a singular file, and in it was this letter. And it's a letter from Wolfgang von Tirpitz, who was the son of the Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who was the head of the German Navy in the First World War. You can see on the slide a quote from it. He says, "A former teacher and friend of mine wishes to leave Germany on account of his Jewish origin. This man, who has none whatever of the disagreeable qualities of his race, is 57 years old and married without children." And obviously there's an interesting part here of how you sell someone by saying the disagreeable qualities of their race. We can come back to that later. But as you can guess, this kind of individual letter written about a man called Ernst Neustadt, Wolfgang von Tirpitz is trying to get him a place somewhere in Britain to allow him to flee. This piqued my interest. And from that point onwards, I started to retrace his life. Thus far, this was the only source that existed of him I could find. But then, as we will see, we've managed to find out a lot more about his existence. Can I have the next slide, please? So Ernst's life, I suppose, begins in Berlin in 1883. He was born to a David Neustadt and Clara Joseph. Both his parents died before the start of the Second World War in the 1910s and 1920s. He did have an older sister, Sophie, but she died only a week before Ernst was born, so Ernst ended up being an only child, as far as I'm aware. The kind of tracing of these people in the past is difficult at the best of times anyway, let alone when many of the families post-World War II no longer exist. In 1989, he enrolled at a school in Tiergarten, a district of Berlin, a famous school there, and one of his classmates was Kurt Hahn, whose role in this story will become important later. He then went on to study at the Friedrich Wilhelm University and going to his PhD in 1906 in philology and classics. She was a classics scholar, read Greek, Latin, published work in both. Can I have the next slide, please? So once he gained his PhD, he then sat the kind of teacher training kind of efficient of the time, and he began employment at Gymnasium, which when I went to Berlin last year for separate research, I decided I had a kind of spare hour or two, so I decided to try and find some of the places that Neustadt had lived, worked at the time. This is a picture I took last year of the kind of original place that he got his first job at. He then moved on to Gymnasium in the second half of 1909 and worked up the ranks to eventually become assistant master of the school there. He started to publish work both in Latin and German in the kind of early 19-teens, and many of these works you can still use to today. People do still actually quote them, which I find interesting that his kind of work still has impact in kind of areas of academic life. Can I have the next slide, please? So moving on to Gertrude, I feel it's important to mention at this point that there is a certain gendered nature of this sort of research, especially at this time. The records for women in this period are nowhere near as detailed. I also had the kind of misfortune of not knowing as much about Gertrude as I did as Neustadt to start with. It means that I was unable to trace any of her schooling, any of her early life, and much about her is relatively unknown. So when I do refer to her, I'm not choosing to focus on Ernst, it's the fact that I know very little about Gertrude's life, apart from her eventual death and kind of a few bits along the way. Nevertheless, she was born in 1889 in Berlin to Max Stadthagen and Clara Schneider. Again, I don't know much about their lives either. She was the only child of that. Again, if the family tree doesn't exist in the first place, and I don't know if they had any siblings, the only alternative to that is going through every record of a period kind of around that birth and trying to find them, which I don't have the patience for to do. And also, it kind of became apparent later on in the story that both of them were likely only children. She married Ernst on the 14th of April 1919 and was at that time listed as a kindergarten teacher. So both of them were kind of education specialists there. We also know from later sources she was a talented pianist. When they were forced to flee in 1939, Ernst wrote to the officials in Frankfurt asking if they could be granted permission to take their grandson piano with them, because it would be key for her to have employment through that means when they arrived. That wasn't allowed. Can I have the next slide, please? So, in 1929, Neustadt and his wife relocated to Frankfurt. They were lured there by the previous head of the school, Karl Reinhardt, who was also a kind of classics scholar. He became head of what was described in the letter that I showed you at the start as a kind of German Westminster. As you can see, it's a very grand school in Frankfurt that last year celebrated its 500th anniversary. He became the headmaster of the famed Goethe-Gymnasium, named after the famous writer and thinker Goethe. In his opening speech to the school, he spoke of the importance of humanism. He quoted Nietzsche and talked of the physical and spiritual development of clear and self-assured humanity. The Goethe-Gymnasium was a kind of humanist stronghold in Frankfurt at that point in time. He extolled the virtues of the ancient Greeks on his faculty and became a well-loved head of the school there. Can I have the next slide, please? As I say, he got this esteemed position in 1929. 4 years later, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor. From this point onwards, the lives of German Jews and later Austrian Jews after the Anschluss in 1938 became a lot more difficult. As you can see from the quote on the board, this is a kind of review of his work in 1934. Now, already in 1933, the Jews had been forced out of many positions in the government and in various professions, like the legal profession. Eventually, teachers became under the scrutiny by 1934. This is a report by Dr. Huth and Dr. Kern. When Neustadt is described as unsuitable for a leadership post in the National Socialist state, it is impossible that his humanitarian, democratic, cosmopolitan, pacifist attitude as a teacher for the German national education can be used. Now, those are the words that I would probably ascribe as positives of a person now, but in 1934, they saw this as a threat to the new Nazi state. So, he is let go of his post. Despite his job being threatened in 1933 initially, he managed to hold on until this report in 1934. He was demoted to a ordinary teacher at the nearby Lessing Gymnasium. As you can see the picture on the board, is that today. His teaching lasted until the end of 1935, when Ernst was forcibly retired under the law for the restoration of the professional service. Basically, you can no longer be Jewish and a teacher. These two things were seen as incompatible. 1935 also marks the start of the Nuremberg laws and the beginning of the thousands of laws imposing restrictions on Jewish life. I think this is also important to note, perhaps, at this point, that to call Neustadt a Jew exclusively is something that is not necessarily how he would have described himself. He was religiously Christian. This is something that's important to note at the time, that the way the Nazis defined who was Jewish and who was not is not necessarily the way that they identified themselves. Many people who did not see themselves as Jewish, religiously, culturally, or otherwise, suddenly became Jewish overnight. We can't say for certain how Neustadt felt about himself and his identity, but at this point, I think it's important to note that the language that we use to describe these people in these sorts of times has always Nazi undertones, that we describe people as a Jew or as a certain way of living when they themselves didn't necessarily see themselves that way. Can I have the next slide, please? So he loses his job in 1935. At that point in time, they're living off of their saved income. There's no other options for work at this point. Now, in terms of migration at this point, many migrations from Germany during the 1930s happened in waves. Firstly, in 1933, so as soon as Hitler comes to power, many leave. They see that this is going to go a certain way, and they leave. The second wave is after the November Pogroms of 1938, more commonly known as Börneplatz. In a letter talking about the contents of his house, the same letter where he asked to keep the grand piano, Neustadt says that until November the 10th, 1938, I had not even remotely thought about emigrating. None of the purchases so between 1933 and 1938, were made with a view to even the possibility of emigration. The point he's making that if he would have thought that he would have had to move, he wouldn't have bought as large furniture and a very grand piano. For the sake of the state, I can also claim credit for the fact that as a teacher and director of studies, I fought destructive and Bolshevik tendencies in the student body so energetically for a decade that the communists magazines criticised them violently in 1929 and 1930. Attacks known to the Ministry of Education were directed against me. So he's pleading his case with the furniture people. He's saying that he shares the same anti-communist stance that many on the right did at that point in time. He also says that until November the 10th, I had not even remotely thought about emigrating. Now, in terms of scholarly debate, there's a debate about this. Did the second wave in 1938 happen because more people wanted to migrate, or because it became easier to migrate after 1938? I say easier in very much inverted the commas. It was still not easy. But Ernst kind of exclusively says here that until November the 10th, he had not thought of it. Can I have the next slide, please? The November Pogroms happened on the 10th of November 1938. I've taken the report from a man that fled to Paris shortly afterwards, where he talks about the November Pogrom in Frankfurt, where they were living at the time. Eugene Wolf says, first of all, the synagogues were set on fire using petrol. The fire brigades restricted themselves to merely protecting the neighbouring buildings. This was a common theme throughout kind of reports from other cities apart from Frankfurt. Young Jewish men were forced to cut the Holocaust into little pieces and burn them. Around 6:30 in the morning, small gangs of 5 to 10 men broke into Jewish homes using force. It was about 9 o'clock when 50 SA in plain clothes suddenly appeared. Some of whom were even known to me, and began to destroy all of the Jewish shops according to a list. And when something was useful, they would take it. Then the wholesale shops were visited, destroyed, and the fittings and wares were thrown into the street. The police were well represented in terms of numbers, yet in no case intervened. The following day, the persecution continued further. So in this report of the time, we see that violence in this case was personal in many regards. Later, the kind of Holocaust becomes known as something that is impersonal, that is industrial, that is mechanical in many ways. This early period very much shows that violence was occurring street by street, shop by shop, home by home. And I think it's important to kind of remember this. The reason that most academics don't use the term Kristallnacht, which is kind of much more commonly known, is twofold. One, it was a term used by the Nazis and was created by the Nazis, so most academics tend not to want to use it under that guise. Two, it means the night of broken glass, which kind of is very euphemistic in terms of like smashing a shop window and that's it. It's much more than that. 10,000 men were imprisoned and sent to camps on this night, to Dachau, to Sachsenhausen, to Belsen at the end of the time. So this notion of it just being a night of broken glass is false. As we see here, it's very much going into people's homes, burning the synagogues, much more, and also violence, murder too, much more than just a broken shop front. Can I have the next slide, please? It's at this point that Ernst decides to flee. Now, I've been able to find many letters written by Ernst and his wife to various people in Britain, trying to convince them to allow him to leave. This is part of more of the full text of the letter which I showed you at the very start, written by Wolfgang von Tirpitz, the man at the bottom of that picture, to Leonard Elmhirst at the top. Just for your own interest, the Elmhirsts were philanthropists and also the owners of a place called Dartington Hall in Totnes, which itself became a haven for refugee academics, artists, sculptors, painters, actors. There was a whole ballet company that relocated to Totnes, which feels like an odd place to kind of put a kind of very liberal Central European ballet company in the 1930s. But it became this kind of cultural haven within the Devon countryside. So I don't know how Ernst heard about this, but either way, Wolfgang von Tirpitz wrote to Elmhirst. He says, a former teacher and friend of mine wishes to leave Germany on account of his Jewish origin. This man, who has none whatsoever of the disagreeable qualities of his race, is 57 years old, married, without children. He is an excellent philologist and was director of the famous college in Frankfurt, where he was held in high esteem by his colleagues. I enclose here with a list of his applications. He says that he knows Italian, French and English, as far as reading, and he has no doubt that this highly gifted man could improve his English in a very short time. He is, after all, a good Christian. He's very much trying to sell Neustadt to a very conservative British public at this point in time. He tries to play down his Jewishness, very aware of the fact that anti-Semitism was rife in Britain at this time. I think we have this notion that anti-Semitism existed in Germany and that was it in Europe. Very much not the case. In some places no better here. He says that he has an ability to get on with young people, and he wouldn't have dared approach him unless he could believe that Ernst could fill any post he was given. Now this didn't work to actually get to Dartington for Ernst. There were nothing spaces at the time. His details were sent on to a colleague of the Elmhirst and then on to other kind of agencies afterwards, but there was no actual thing that came from this first letter which I found. Can I have the next slide, please? These attempts to flee continued. Ernst wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. I'm not sure how many people did actually write to the Archbishop personally, but it'd be interesting to find out nevertheless. Ernst confirms that I nor my wife have any relations abroad so as to be able to provide us with an affidavit for America or Australia. There is a danger that we can't leave this country. As our situation in this country grows more threatening from day to day, help must arrive soon, otherwise it arrives too late. So he pleads with the Archbishop. This same letter was sent to Gordon Murray, who was a professor of Greek at Oxford, and also Walter Adams, who was another academic. Attached to this letter are kind of references about Ernst's character. He says there's a quote from a parent of a student at the Goethe-Gymnasium. He says, as a progressive man of pure and clear character and the greatest love for each single pupil and for his colleagues, he soon helped this college to flower anew. Obviously, we kind of have to take into consideration that these people are trying to kind of get Ernst a place out of Germany, but I think it's also a testament to his character that these people were willing to help him in that way. There was an extra line added to later letters which Ernst said to people. He says that if it's not possible to get me a position immediately, I need most urgently an invitation to England in order to wait in security without the daily humiliation for the result of my further endeavours. He's worried that if he stays any longer, he will not be able to leave and it will just get worse. All of these letters are now held by the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning, now known as the Council for At-Risk Academics, which still exists to this day. It's important to note at this point that they turned him down. They said that Ernst was not an academic, even though he had published loads of works at this point, but because he was employed by a secondary school, they did not care for him. Can I have the next slide, please? However, Ernst and Gertrude do manage to make it to Britain in the summer of 1939, a few months before the war breaks out, when emigration to Britain became a lot more difficult and often impossible in many cases. Exactly how the Neustadts ended up here and how they got this position, I do not know. There are no records to show exactly what occurred here. Nevertheless, he ends up at Gordonstoun School, the famous education place of the current king and Prince Philip. Kurt Hahn was the guy that I told you about earlier, that he was a classmate of Neustadt's in Berlin. I like to think that was the link, but I can't prove that, so it's just my own thoughts. He was the founder of the Schulschloss of Salem in Germany, which he left in 1933, and he instead founded Gordonstoun in 1934 in the Scottish Highlands. Kurt Hahn took on many refugee academics and pupils at this school, which unnerved many in the local area. In a letter to the Secretary of State for Scotland, one resident wrote, "The fact that these aliens are still in our midst is calling for a good deal of public comment. But after all, their true national allegiance is to their Vaterland. It is the general opinion of the community here that if these German aliens were interned, there would be a greater degree of security." This is one letter amongst the community of many hundreds, if not thousands of people around the school who supported the kind of efforts that Kurt Hahn and Gordonstoun put forward here. So I quote this letter with a degree of trepidation over it, kind of representing the overall views of the population at this point. Can I have the next slide, please? Nevertheless, what it does refer to is that the internment of these so-called enemy aliens occurred during the war. And this is a very unknown period, I think, of Britain's wartime past and experience. That we interned thousands and thousands of refugees that had fled. We didn't distinguish them from those kind of Germans who were here, not having fled, or those Nazi sympathisers who were also here. Refugees were given a kind of initial tribunal in 1939 and were categorised as either A, B or C, as in ones that were a kind of immediate threat that were going to be interned there, and ones that were genuine refugees, as they call it. In May 1940, the issue was given to collar the lot by Churchill. So people in coastal areas, people in kind of areas of strategic importance were imprisoned in camps all around the country, first in schools, in race courses, in university buildings, and later many were sent to the Isle of Man. Ernst was one of these. The teachers at Gordonstoun that were from nationals were interned in May 1940. Neustadt was sent to Lingfield Racecourse, the complete other end of the country. He was then sent to a camp in Liverpool and eventually to central Promenade camp on the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man basically became an island surrounded by barbed wire. About 6 or 7 camps on the island full of German and Austrian refugees. George Bell, who was the Bishop of Chester at the time, visited Central Rhineland camp and spoke of the high quality of the people there, and lamented the men and the aimless walking about. These camps became artistic hubs though. They had camp universities, camp newspapers, camp lectures, and you can see the quote at the bottom. I managed to find a guy called Martin Oswald, who later became an academic himself. He mentioned Ernst Neustadt and said, "We did have a lively intellectual life with many interesting people in the camp giving lectures. Professor Ernst Neustadt, who had been teaching at a gymnasium in Berlin, had brought with him a volume of Greek lyric poetry, and a small circle of us enjoyed it, and his commentary on the poets." So various refugees have discussed these camps so differently. Either they love the experience of being in this kind of cultural hub of academic, artistic life, but many completely resented this, that they had fled to a country that was deemed to keep them safe and they were imprisoned, some for many, many years. Can I have the next slide, please? This is Neustadt's internment card. It's after his tribunal in 1939. You can see he's listed as a teacher of classics and history at Gordonstoun School on the two bottom ones, and then this big stamp, interned, which from May 1940. At the top it says Category 18, released 29th of the 8th, 1940. Now, Category 18 was reserved for it's reserved for cases of extreme conditions. I can't think of the actual word of it. Nevertheless, it was reserved for people whose condition meant that they couldn't stay in the camp anymore. The extreme hardship or something like that it was. Now, we don't know exactly why Ernst was released. Context tells us that these categories was often reserved for people whose people outside of the internment relied on them. We know from later sources that Gertrude was suffering with cancer at this point in time. Neustadt was released from internment on the other man to look after his sick wife. Can I have the next slide, please? After his release from internment, the Gordonstoun School has moved by that point to Wales, and they instead relocate to London to Belsize Park, number 53, Belsize Park Gardens. Some of you may know that Belsize Park became the heart of this new liberal Jewish movement in London, and still a large Jewish neighbourhood to this day. In May of 1941, after his release, Ernst writes to his mother-in-law, who was still alive and living in Berlin. It's from this letter we learn that Ernst had been sending her money. Ernst writes to his mother-in-law, Clara Stahlhagen, saying he can't support her anymore. He had no job, no income, and he'd been interned for the last few months, and there were no prospects of getting a new job. Their money was running out. As we know, his wife had cancer and could not work at this point in time, so their income was completely depleted. He writes to his mother-in-law through the Red Cross and says that he cannot support her anymore. In October, Clara dies in Berlin, completely destitute. As a context point at this point in time, this is where the war and the Holocaust starts to take a new existence. In June, the Soviet Union is invaded and the Holocaust by bullets begins, the mass shootings in the East. In autumn, a few days after Clara dies, the deportations from Berlin begin. The order was given in September 1941 by Hitler to deport the Jews from the Greater German Reich to the ghettos in Wutz, in Minsk and in Riga. This is the beginning of what becomes the move to camps. after this. The next slide, please. I put this quote up here because I think it's at this point important to recognise the struggle that refugees like Neustadt faced at the time. This is a quote by Hannah Arendt, a very famous philosopher, most famous for her work in Jerusalem after the Archival trial. She wrote in 1943 a short essay called We Refugees, and she says, "The story of our struggle has finally become known. We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life." For Ernst, in this case, he lost his job, his house in Frankfurt, and had not been able to take any of his possessions with him. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. For Ernst, he had gone from being head of one of the most famous schools in Germany to unemployed teacher in London. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of the gestures, and the unaffected expression of feelings. We left our relatives in the Polish ghettos, and our best friends had been killed in concentration camps, and that means the rupture of our private lives. So here, Hannah Arendt attests to the difficulty of someone who has fled at this point in time. Can I have the next slide, please? It's at this point that we arrive in the city we are now, at Wakefield. The SPSL, so the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning, had referred Ernst to the Joint Scholastic Agency, who I presume facilitated Ernst's new job at Wakefield Grammar School in September 1941. He was given a temporary war appointment, and he was one of two refugees that had been taken on at this point in September 1941. The other being Dr. Günther Helen, architect, who was the former runner of a very famous observatory. You can see a picture of him there. Ernst was paid more than Günther because he had a much more prestigious academic background. Can I have the next slide, please? At this point, the Neustadts move in with Irene and Oscar Turbo. They were medical doctors who had, from the quote you can see there, they moved out of London to some place which he can't remember. They got a license to be a doctor in Britain, and they moved to the coal mining district in Yorkshire in Wakefield. They had first lived in a small house, and later on they bought a much larger house because nobody else had in the wartime wanted to buy a large house. They got it very cheap. It's in this house that Ernst and Gertrud moved into. So they lived with Irene and Oscar and their son Raymond, who you can see there, who is alive still. He is 101, I think. And it's in this house that Ernst began his life teaching at Wakefield Grammar School. Can I have the next slide, please? However, when we start to learn about Ernst's time at Wakefield Grammar School, we realise the toll that his refugee life has taken upon him. In an extract from a book on the history of the school, Ronald Chapman writes, Dr. Neustadt, a former headmaster and classicist, was a disastrous appointment. He bitterly resented his situation, and his relationship with the boys was raw. The desperately unhappy man committed suicide. In a letter from 2002 about a recollection about Stadt's time, a former student wrote, "He was a very unhappy man, very much feared and hated by the boys there, and there'll be few now who remember him." This is a very far cry from the man that spoke of the importance of the humanist tradition that was loved by his students and that was recommended by so many academics and parents when he left Frankfurt. Have the next slide, please. On the 25th of April 1942, Ernst took his own life. 4 weeks after his wife Gertrude had formally died, had died of cancer. He took his own life in the house owned by the Turtles for Belgrave Terrace, Eastmore Road. It was reported in many newspapers around the country, including the Yorkshire Observer, which I put the part of it there. I think at this point it's important to note, kind of the next slide please. Again, I'm quoting Hannah Arendt. Wherever the European Jews are living today, they are no longer behaving accordingly to statistical laws. Suicides occur not only among the panic-stricken people in Berlin and Vienna and in Bucharest or Paris, but in New York and Los Angeles, in Buenos Aires and Montevideo, and also, as we know, in Wakefield. For many Jewish refugees of the 1930s, life was not easy. Migration was difficult. Being a refugee was difficult. Knowing the situation that you were left behind was difficult. When you arrived and could not work, you were demoted from your position. You were interned. Your wife was ill. Your wife died. I didn't mention here that he was sacked from his job from Wakefield Grammar School because he was in such a bad place in 1942. So that's where Neustatt's story ends, and Gertrude's story ended in 1942. I'm sure that some people weren't aware that that was how the story ended, but I think it's important to tell the stories of these two people, perhaps because they exemplify the difficulty that we face when discussing these type of stories, that we assume that fleeing the Holocaust means one is safe. We assume that fleeing this sort of persecution means your life is automatically going to be better. And actually, as we've learned from Ernst and Gertrud's story, it's not always that case. I was meant to put it on the PowerPoint, but there's a quote by a historian called where she says, the Holocaust didn't stop with migration, it's moved it elsewhere. What she means by that is these are still part of the stories of the Holocaust. As Linda said in our introduction, the concerns, the lives affected by the forced migration, by the genocide occurring in Central Europe at this point in time, massively affected Ernst and Gertrud's life. Can I have the next slide, please? However, I feel I should end on a more positive note than what I've currently said. When it became apparent after I had learned all about their life, I wrote to this church and I said, are they buried here? I asked that, but I knew that they already were. I just wanted to kind of confirm. On the top left, you can see a register of the burials from 1942 from this church here. I put a red ring around Gertrude's name. But I know that Ernst was also buried here. He appears in the burial register and also on the list. He was buried on the same plot as his wife Gertrude had been buried only a few weeks later. I asked the church, can you take a picture of this grave? I want to see what's there. And you can see on the bottom left picture, there was a very small kind of hit in the ground with Gertrude's name only. She had died first, but presumably Ernst had organised something to put there in place. When Ernst died, there was no one left. They had no family, they had no relatives, they had no children. As far as I'm aware, they had no friends at that point in time. This was at the same point in time where two Stolpersteine had been laid in Frankfurt. I'd been part of a research project with the school, with the faculty of the Goethe-Gymnasium and the Lessing Gymnasium in Frankfurt. They had laid these two Stolpersteine during COVID in 2020. I then started to fundraise with the help of these school there for a headstone for Ernst. He didn't have one. Gertrude had a very small plaque, so we raised just over £2,000 to get a headstone put in, which we're going to see in a minute. People from Wakefield Grammar School, people from the Goethe-Gymnasium, members of the public, academics, all donated to help put this in place. Because it was in COVID, I didn't actually see it until a year and a bit after it had been put in, when we came up here to actually see what had been kind of the results of years of research. And that was in 2022. I think I came in and saw it. So as I said at the start, this feels like a full circle moment for me to be here talking about his story, because it doesn't end how we want it to, and I think that's important. We want it to be a happy story of refugees that fled and escaped and lived a better life. Ernst and Gertrud didn't end that way. I'd like to end just by reading a poem that was read at the laying of the Gordonstoun in Frankfurt. It's written by Helen, who was a Jewish poet, thinker, author at the time. The Nazis had tried to forbid his poetry and songs, but Helen was too popular, so they kind of abandoned their efforts. I'll read it in German and English. If there are any German speakers, I apologise for butchering. Ich hatte einst ein schönes Warteland. Der Eichenbaum wuchs dort so hoch, die Wirbelchen nickten sanft, es war ein Traum. Das küsste mich auf Deutsch und sprach auf Deutsch. Man glaubt, es kam, wie gut es klang, das Wort ich liebe dich, es war ein Traum. Once I had a beautiful native land. The oak tree grew so high there, the violets nodded softly. It was a dream. It kissed me in German and said in German, you could scarcely believe how good it sounded. I love you. It was a dream. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you very much. There's a list of the people that kind of helped with this research that took place over years and years across multiple countries, across multiple archives. A lot of the research in Germany was done by a man called Manfred Kappmann, who sadly passed away in December last year. So I will end my talk there. If anyone has any kind of immediate burning questions, they can ask me now, but I believe we're going to have a question kind of informally a bit later. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Charlie, for telling us Ernst and Gertrud's deeply moving and deeply sad story. And you're going through that thinking, where are they now? What's happened? And then to find out that they didn't make it. And I think that's really important because we do tend to focus on the success stories. My research has focused on those success stories. And what we see here is those ripples of harm. So Ernst and Gertrud weren't murdered in a concentration camp, they weren't murdered in their homes. They got out, and for most people that would be, oh, they're safe. But to see those ripples of harm continue. And I think there's also these echoes and reflections of, we can see the language that was used then about refugees is being used now in our media. And it's the same language and it's the same message, and that is so deeply hurtful that we've got ideas around none of the disagreeable qualities of his race. That just feels like a horrific thing to say about anyone, irrespective of ethnicity. And the idea that he is, after all, a good Christian, to that idea that we have to pretend that someone is different in order to be accepted. So there's now going to be an opportunity for us to visit Ernst and Gertrud's grave if you wish to. If not, there's refreshments through the maze rooms, and we'll walk down to the grave in a few minutes once people have had a chance to gather themselves and make their way through into the maze rooms behind me. And as Charlie said, he'll be delighted to answer any questions you have, and so please do chat to him afterwards. And please join me again in thanking Charlie for his time and his effort today. Thank you.